Okay, we're going to dive into the history of parties and talk about why there has been a two-party system in the United States. And so we're going to start with the first party system that lasts from about 1790s to the 1824 presidential election. And so the two groups are the Federalists and the Jeffersonian Republicans. And so you should think about the Federalists from the Federalist Papers, and that might give you an idea of what their general philosophy is versus Jefferson and the Jeffersonian Republicans and what their thoughts are. So if we think about what the Federalists wanted, they wanted a strong central government, and Jefferson from the Virginia area was wanting more of a states' rights point of view. And so although there were all sorts of big issues that the new government had to face, the most important was this issue of how strong should the federal government be. And we talked about this when we talked about federalism. And so although George Washington really struggled to remain above all the quarrels that revolved around these issues, his Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, became the leader of the Federalists, a group which favored strong actions by a strong central government to solve public problems. And so this over here is Alexander Hamilton. Of course, this is Thomas Jefferson. The rival party, called the Jeffersonians, often called the Anti-Federalists, after its leader Thomas Jefferson. It's also called the Democrat Republicans, or sometimes just Republicans. All right, so you've got this name game going on, but let's just call them the Jeffersonian Republicans so that we don't confuse them with the later Democrats. All right, so this is the rival party, and they favor a weaker national government and more local autonomy. And these are issues that we still hear about today. We still hear about one political party wanting more national government, and we hear about the other political party that wants smaller federal government. Okay, so the Federalists wanted a stronger federal government. They also wanted to protect tariffs, commercial ties with Britain. So you can see where the Federalists are really wanting to have a bigger government and more power to the national government. The Jeffersonians were more in favor of free trade, concentrated on the issues of agriculture and relations with France. And this is going to play, later on when we have the War of 1812, and hopefully you'll study that in history. We won't go into it here, but you can start to see the different political parties being aligned with other countries even. Okay, so Hamilton and Jefferson are the heads of the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, and these two gentlemen are often considered the fathers of the modern political system. After the election of John Adams in 1796, the Federalists began to die out. By 1816, it had disappeared completely, leaving the United States with only the Jeffersonian Republican, or the Democratic Republicans, as the major party. At this time, remember, the candidates for the presidency and the vice presidency were chosen by the congressional leaders of the party. And if you didn't have connections with them and you weren't in their good graces, you didn't have a chance to be elected to the presidency. Okay, so this is where we had really the electoral process for the presidency centered in the Congress, because they're the ones who chose the nominees for the election. Okay. The Jeffersonian Republicans later become the Democrats. Keep that in mind. So today's Democratic Party comes from Jefferson's original Republican Party. So you can see you had the Federalists represented by Hamilton here, and the Anti-Federalists. They got together, put the Constitution, and remember, in order to satisfy the Anti-Federalists, the Bill of Rights was added to the Constitution. These Anti-Federalists become what are known as the Democratic Republicans, or the Jeffersonian Republicans, and then you have the Federalists. And by the end of this period, the Federalists die out, and you have one major party. But that ends in 1824. Okay? And again, this becomes the modern Democratic Party. So you have to kind of watch how this flows, if you will. All right, the second party system, well, let me finish up with the first party system. In the middle of the first party system, you had the Revolution of 1800, and this is not really a revolution per se in terms of fighting, but this is considered a revolution because in the 1800 election, this was the first time in world history in which one party, the Federalist Party of John Adams, this gentleman right here, willingly gave up power because they lost the election to another party, that of Thomas Jefferson, without bloodshed. This is the first time in world history that you didn't have a war or other type of a coup in order to have one leader replaced by another leader. And here's the breakout of the vote. You could see where the Federalists are dominant here in the light pink color, and then the Jefferson vote is all in the green. Okay, so that's happening during the first party system. All right, the second party system is from 1824 to 1852. The Democratic Party rises out to replace the Jeffersonian Republican Party, and this is going to be the new Democratic Party with Andrew Jackson as the leader. And then the Federalists have died out and they're replaced by the Whigs. Okay, so Andrew Jackson is really the individual more associated with politics of the common man, even though we think of that as Jefferson. So the Democratic Party rose to replace the Democratic Republicans, and Andrew Jackson is elected in 1828 and re-elected in 1832. And part of the reason for the disappearance of Jeffersonian's old party was the use of congressional caucuses to select candidates, and that was unpopular. The idea that the candidates were selected by a small group of the elite was never too popular with U.S. citizens, and there were allegations that John Quincy Adams, who was elected in 1824, was nominated due to bargains struck in the congressional caucus and that corruption was involved. So bargains were happening behind the scene about who was going to be chosen to be the national candidates. And people who managed to be on the side of the winner tended to be given cabinet posts as rewards. So after the 1824 election, the Democratic Party and the Whig Party began to form. And in 1828, they held the first national party conventions in order to pick their national candidates. In general, the Democrats of Andrew Jackson distrusted the central government. They were friends of the farmers of the western United States, and they were the stronger of the two parties. The Whig parties really take up after the Federalists, which became the National Republicans for a very brief period of time, so they become the Whigs. They're centered more in New England, favored the interest of merchants, and wanted a stronger federal government. And so here you see the Jackson Democrats going up against the National Republicans. If we go back a screen, we can see, well, several screens. These Federalists become the National Republicans for about a nanosecond. And then they become the Whigs, and Jackson populism takes over, and this becomes a Democratic Party. Okay. During this time, the Whigs is the minority party, but it succeeded in electing some presidents like William Henry Harrison, and 3 times it nominated a military leader in an effort to gain support, and twice succeeded in selecting them, the William Henry Harrison that I just mentioned and Zachary Taylor. But during this period, you had intense competition for voters, and it led politicians to try and increase suffrage. And suffrage is an interesting word. It sounds painful, like you're suffering, but suffrage really means the right to vote, or the franchise, the right to vote. So competition was so fierce during this time, they started to need more people to vote, so this is why more and more individuals were given the right to vote. And parties divided more by personalities, and if you think about Andrew Jackson as Old Hickory, he was a very flamboyant, very charismatic individual. Eventually the Whigs are going to be replaced by a coalition. Remember, a coalition is just a group of people who try to unite in order to further their interests. So you have this coalition of free labor, free soil, and free land supporters that become more important to the Whigs as we move forward toward the Civil War. So let's talk a little bit about what a realignment is. Okay. And so the third party system happens right upon the eve of the Civil War from 1856 to 1892. And so we're going to talk about what a major realignment is. A realignment is when large groups or segments of the population who have traditionally supported one party shift their support to another. So this can happen for several reasons. One is that you have a whole new crop of voters entering the electorate that's going to cause a shift. But there's also a variety of other reasons why a party realignment will occur. Okay? One is because there's been some disruption of the existing political order because of some decisive issue like slavery. Another reason why party alignment or realignment might occur is that the voters shift their support strongly in favor of one party versus the other. And we can think about that happening in the South in the United States, where Democrats were replaced by Republicans almost overnight. The individuals didn't change, they just switched parties to better align themselves with what their ideology was. A third thing that might happen is that there might be a major change in policy that occurs through the action of a particular party. And then you might have an enduring change in the party coalition. It might be that you lose favor with one coalition member or another, which was an advantage to the dominant party, but that group moved to another party. And so political scientists have argued that it oftentimes takes a realignment to occur in order to make parties change their behavior. So for example, they argue that what it takes to cause political parties to realign might be something like a great moral issue. Slavery, for example, was such an issue. And the Whigs dissolved in large part because they were unable to reach an agreement on the slavery issue. And many of the elements then became a part of the Republican Party. So out of the demise of the Whig Party, which was unable to come to terms with how to solve the slavery issue, you have a new party emerge, and this is the Republican Party. Okay. So again, we have these Jacksonian Democrats become what is known as the War Democrats versus the Whigs. Then you have the secessionist Democrats versus the Republicans. So this Whig become the Republican Party. Abraham Lincoln is a Republican. I think people like to identify him as a Democrat, but he's actually a Republican. Okay. So Northerners, progressive whites, and many of those settling in the West, along with activists from former minor parties such as the Liberty and Free Soil Party, came together in 1854 to form the Republican Party. And their big issue was they wanted to abolish slavery. Okay. So it's here that the Democrats become the secessionist Democrats. So you have Northern Democrats, Southern Democrats, and you have Republicans. Okay. The Republicans at this time were anti-slavery, pro-business, which attracted the Northeastern interests that had been a part of the Whig Party, and also many in the North and the West who were against slavery. So the Republicans replaced the Democrats as the nation's majority party, and this was the realignment. The Democrats were strong in the South. They were pro-slavery, and after slaves were freed, these were the states' rights groups. So the Republicans become the strong central government. They want to abolish slavery during the Civil War period, and the Democrats were the groups that wanted to have smaller government and states' rights. Of course, this has switched for today's Republican and Democratic Party. But this is what happened during the third party system. This is the Civil War and the post-war system. Remember, Republicans want higher tariffs to protect industry. They wanted no slavery in the new territories. They wanted to expand westward. Both parties did. This is that manifest destiny. Democrats want lower tariffs to promote agriculture. Smaller local government is what they preferred, and they're pro-slavery. Okay. This is the election of Abraham Lincoln, and you can see how you have really a regional divide. Lincoln's vote is predominantly in the North and the Western states. The Southern Democrats are fielding their candidate versus the Northern Democrats, so you have the Democrats splitting the vote here. Okay. And then you have a constitutional party that is a small third party. Okay. But you can see here, this is the dominance of Abraham Lincoln and win the 1860 election. And then the Civil War breaks out in 1861. So Republicans dominate during this period up through the 1892 period, which leads to the fourth system. In 1896 to right up into the year that FDR is elected. Okay, this is known as the era of Republican dominance. Okay, and this is brought about in large part by the industrialization of America. Remember, the Republicans were the party that had policies encouraging rapid industrialization. The Democrats during this time were still centered in the South, but also in the West. There's no real Democratic presence in the North, and the Republicans are pretty much dominating politics at this time. They were from the areas that were not yet industrialized, that produced raw materials and agricultural parties. So the industrial policies of the Republican Party, according to the Democrats, ignored the rest of the world, or the rest of the United States, that was very poor and rural. Its solution to the problems, however, were looked at as being radical by those in the North. Between 1896 and 1932, the Democrats were only successful in electing one president, Woodrow Wilson, and he probably would not have been elected if it wasn't for a split in the Republican Party. So William McKinley is elected in 1896. He is a Republican. He is not in office very long because he's assassinated, so Teddy Roosevelt succeeds McKinley into the presidency, and Teddy Roosevelt is a Republican. Okay. William Howard Taft becomes president in 1908 to 1912. Okay. So Taft would later become a Supreme Court justice. But there was a disagreement between Teddy Roosevelt and William Howard Taft in the 1912 election that led to the split. And so the Republican Party splits in half, and Teddy Roosevelt starts a third party called the Bull Moose Party. Okay. This allows Woodrow Wilson basically to be elected from the Democratic Party in 1913. So Woodrow Wilson is the president during World War I. And so he's the only Democrat elected president during this time period until FDR assumes office in 1932. Okay. All right, so let's talk about that. Well, one more thing before I move forward. During this fourth party system, and this is a picture of William Jennings Bryan, who was a great orator of his day, Democrats and Republican parties became much more developed, much more organized, and worked really to attract a loyal body of voters. Okay, and so this is a time where people would go out and campaign and give big oratory speeches about particular issues. Okay, all right. The fifth party system is during the FDR period, the New Deal coalition, right up until LBJ is president. Okay. So this is another major realignment. All right, this is the era of Democratic dominance. If we had an era of Republican dominance before, this is the era of Democratic dominance. And it starts with FDR and the New Deal. The Republican Party, remember, was pro-business, pro-industrialization, and anti-government interference in the economic sphere. But because of the Great Depression that began really in the 1929, with the 1929 crash, this particular focus on pro-business and pro-industrialization was not solving the nation's problems. So the Democrats nominate FDR in 1932 and became the party that wanted a strong federal government to intervene on behalf of the poor and unemployed that were having hard times due to the Great Depression. Okay. And so Roosevelt puts together this broad electorate, this broad coalition, this New Deal coalition made up of the following groups: the urban working class, members of newer ethnic groups that were immigrants, the bulk of the American Catholics and Jews, the poor of the South, and liberal intellectuals. So this was a very diverse coalition, and this gives birth to the New Deal liberals. Excuse me. So let me just give you a rundown of who was involved as a New Deal liberal. They wanted to have the government solve the nation's problems. They believed in a strong president. They wanted to curb big business and help those who were considered the underdogs in the marketplace. In order to pay for this type of oversight, they did not object to taxes or deficit spending. They favored labor and the working people, particularly the working poor. New Deal liberals were also more likely to be minorities. They supported government action to foster unemployment and solve the unemployment issues during the Great Depression. They wanted to help those who were unable to help themselves, and they were particularly interested in pursuing civil liberties. And so since the Roosevelt administration and continuing on to the 1950s and 60s, the Democratic Party became the party that was more strongly in favor of federal intervention to encourage civil rights in the South, for example, and to promote civil liberties. So it really was a system where there was an expansion in the reach of government, more regulation of the workplace. If you think about all those court cases we talked about during the civil rights and civil liberties case, this is part of the New Deal coalition's actions. They wanted to create a social, and did create a social safety net, and it really created this broad coalition of voters that sustained itself into the late 1960s. But then this New Deal alignment starts to unravel. It starts to lose steam by the late 1960s. This has meant that over this period of time, the Republicans had gradually gained some strength in the South as Southern whites became disenchanted with the Democratic Party and became Republicans. Political scientists disagree about whether or not this was a major realignment, like it was with the Civil War. But many others argue that this end of the New Deal coalition was indeed a form of realignment because you have an evolution toward conservative Republicans' domination. It was gradual, not as intense or as quick as the Civil War realignment or the New Deal realignment, but it was a particularly growing movement of individuals into the more conservative Republican Party based upon issues that were really about moral issues, the issues regarding abortion and family issues. And so a good year to draw the line from 1968 to when this alignment really begins is the 1980s, and this is with the election of Ronald Reagan. And so while many people might not think of it as a realignment, they think of it more as perhaps a de-alignment, where the idea is people are just removing themselves from either political party and not jumping into the other political party. So was it a movement back to Republican dominance? Many people believe so, but these are the issues that really were of major concern: abortion, family values, Reagan. And so this is really the Reagan years. And this is what people try to invoke today with trying to get back to those Reagan years from the Republican perspective. These issues about abortion and family values are playing still today between the Democrats and the Republicans, and we're going to hear more about this in the 2012 election. All right, so this movement back to kind of classic conservatives, they believe that the best government is one that is a smaller one, wants to have less taxes, wants to have a balanced budget and a decentralization of power, favors deregulation of business, favors strong defense, generally wants a strong Congress. It appeals to affluent and the middle class, and the loyalty trends today for the Republican Party tend to be from professionals, executive, white-collar workers, high-status Protestants, married couples. So you can kind of see where the split is between those who are supportive of the Republican Party and those who are supportive of the Democratic Party. So we wind up with two major parties, the Democrats and the Republicans. So why do we have a two-party system? All right. A multi-party system is one where you have 5 or 10 more parties who regularly compete in elections and win seats and have some chance of gaining power. In order for you to have a multi-party system, you have to have a system that has proportional representation. And while this is a characteristic of most democratic nations, it's not a characteristic of the United States. We have a system where we only have 2 parties. Okay, so while most democratic nations are characterized by this 5, 10, or sometimes even more parties regularly competing in elections, the United States only has 2. And the reason for that is something called Duverger's law. Okay, if we think about a spectrum from the left to the right, this is what many, on the top row here, this is what many European countries look like. So I'll just give you an example of Germany to kind of talk you through these different groups. All right. In the German case, there are 3 major dominant parties. There's the Christian Democratic Union, the CDU, and the Christian Social Union, which is more popular in the South. These are on the right. So these are your conservative parties. There's 2 of them about right here for the Germans. And then the Social Democratic Party is on the left, what would be considered the Liberal Party. So in comparison to the United States, the Social Democratic Party would be the Democrats, and the Christian Democratic Union and the Christian Social Union would be the Republicans. But they also have some additional parties. They have the Free Democratic Party. It's a smaller liberal party that often enters into a coalition with one of these two groups, so it's here on the left. Then there's the Green Party that moves closer or moves more to the left into the socialist realm. They have some parties even further to the left. So there is the Left Party. It's it is a coalition between the Party of the Democratic Socialists and the New Labor and Social Justice Party. These are moving much more further left to more of the socialist realm. And then there's obviously there's more parties on the right. There's a German People's Union, the neo-Nazi National Democratic Party, and so there's groups that move over here to the right. They have a multi-party system, okay? So what happens if the Green Party gets at least more than 5% of the vote, then 5% of the individuals in the German parliament are going to be representing the Green Party. So they have proportional representation. So if, like I said, the Green Party or a Socialist Party or a party on the right, they have to win at least 5% of the popular vote to get representation in Parliament. So what you end up having is a coalition government. Usually the Conservatives can't field enough of the vote in order to win a majority, so they have to form coalitions with some groups in order to win elections. Okay. We have a two-party system in the United States. It's called a single-member district, first-past-the-post type of system. Okay? So if we think about how you can win an election, there's really three types of winning rules. In a majority election, the winner is the candidate who wins over 50% of the vote. In a plurality election, the candidate that gets the most votes, whether it's a majority of the votes or not, wins. So we have plurality elections in the United States. Okay, you don't have to win 50% of the vote to win an election. We've seen that, but you have to win more than any other candidate. Okay, we don't have proportional representation. Okay, the practice of proportional representation system is generally to have multi-member districts. That is that there are multiple representatives from each district and they're divided in rough proportion of the vote. So let's say, for example, that we have a situation where there's 10 seats up for grabs and the Democrat receives 50% of the vote, the Republican receives 40% of the vote, and the Libertarian receives 10% of the vote. In that case, 5 Democrats would have seats, 4 Republicans would have seats, and 1 Libertarian would. That's a proportional representation system. That's not how it works in Texas. In the upcoming election for the House member for this particular district, if they win 48% of the vote, they get the seat. It's a single-member district. One person gets the seat. Okay? If he wins 60% of the vote, he wins the seat. It doesn't matter. He just has to win more than someone else. So when you have a plurality system, you're going to have a two-party system. And this is Duverger's law. It states the following. It says that nations with plurality and majority elections, the parties must try to reach out and appeal to a large percentage of the public in order to win representation. And so we see that. We see right now the Republicans are off in their primary trying to win the nominee. But once the Republican gets a nominee, they're going to go up against Barack Obama in August. And August through November, they're going to campaign against each other, and whoever wins the most votes wins. Okay, it's first past the post. We'll talk about the Electoral College later, but just in general, it's whoever has the most votes win. Okay, if you have proportional representation like you do up here in the German case, where you have multi-member districts, a party does not need to do this to gain representation, so splinter groups can gain representation. The Green Party is never going to win elections in the United States because they cannot win a majority. Okay? And so what they do is that the Democrats include the Green Party movement in their particular platform in the United States. So if you're asked, why don't we have third parties in the United States? It's because our electoral system doesn't reward third parties. Third parties are rewarded in multi-system proportional representation types of governance. We have a single-member district, first past the post, majority system in America, so there is no reward for a third-party candidate getting 20% of the vote. He gets nothing. Third-party candidates who win 20% of the vote here get 20% of the representation. So I hope that I've made this clear, that the number of parties that are really dominant in a particular country depends on its electoral system. So the reason why we don't have a multi-party system that's really functioning is because we have the electoral process that we have. Okay, so that's why we have two major parties. That's not to say that in the last presidential election there weren't these other contenders. They run in order to talk about a particular issue, but you can see that they're never going to get any vote, because for the rational voter, Ralph Nader is never going to win. So I need to vote for the person most like Ralph Nader, which is Barack Obama. Okay, so hopefully that was clear about why we have a two-party system in the United States. All right, let's take a break here, and we'll come back and talk a little bit about elections and how people vote.